Hey, this is Bear River, and I've got my friend Alex here. We are going to be talking about we're just going to let you drop right in as if you've been eavesdropping on this conversation. We're going to talk a bit about a news story that we saw this week and some related history. I'm going to let Alex just kind of intro you on how we got here.
Yeah, hey Bear. So what happened earlier this week was we saw a really interesting article about NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, I believe is what it's called. And we just had an extended series of conversations on the astrology of this particular issue and how it relates to the national astrology for the United States chart. And we thought it was a really interesting conversation. So we wanted to immortalize the conversation a little bit and share it with you and bring all of you into it.
Yeah. It's also a really interesting teachable moment for this technique or doctrine. I guess it's kind of a doctrine of subsumption, which Alex can tell you a bit more about.
Yeah, so subsumption is the idea that each chart exists within the context of all the charts that came before it as root charts, with more or less relevance depending on which chart it actually is. So in this case, we're going to be walking you through a number of charts that will relate to each other, including a couple different national charts for the United States, the chart of a university, a nativity of a person, and then the inception chart of a law.
Yeah.
And how all of these different charts interact with each other.
Yep. And then we'll even talk a little bit about how some of the recent eclipses have tied into some news stories related to other institutions. It's pretty sprawling, but I think it's a good example of how these things worked. And I know for some of my followers, if you've been following me for a while, you've heard me talk a lot about my idea that the astrological generations might have more to do with synodic cycles than with planetary ingresses per se. And part of it has to do with this idea of subsumption, that somebody who's born in between one, let's say Pluto-Uranus conjunction, and the next is going to be tied into that previous synodic cycle. And here, I think in this conversation, the Jupiter-Saturn cycle and the Uranus-Pluto cycle will show up, possibly another one. But why don't we go ahead and dive in? I've got my little cheat sheet for all these charts. We'll see if Solar Fire agrees with us today. Please, Hermes, let these charts.
We are going to be putting Solar Fire under some severe stress today. So yes. Let's hope she can handle it.
All right, so let's start with the good old United States. This is the famous Sibley chart, 12 degrees Sagittarius rising. This is in whole sign, of course. Let's see here. What are your thoughts on this chart, particularly in the context of the conversation we'll be having today?
Yeah, I really like this chart. I think there are other charts that work for the US. I've always found this chart to be a really interesting one to think with. I think particularly with the shared rulership of the ascendant and the fourth sign being ruled by Jupiter, having this very outward expressive national character in terms of the ascendant being in Sagittarius, but then the fourth sign being Pisces, and this kind of nebulous relationship with the land that the United States has. And then of course, both of those being ruled by Jupiter in Cancer, this exalted Jupiter, but being in the 8th house and actually referring to other people's resources in terms of the land itself, the even pieces of the character, the idea of the melting pot feels like an 8th house kind of metaphor in itself. So we have the metaphors of manifest destiny that work really well with the ascendant, the Sagittarian ascendant, and then the melting pot working just so well with the Jupiter and Cancer. Whatever we think of those ideas, they are ideas that are put forward as part of the American national character.
Absolutely.
What do you think of this chart? I know you use the Howland chart as well.
I am a big fan of the Howland chart. I go back and forth. Right now, I'm toying with the idea that the Howland chart speaks to America's big fuck you to England, and that the Sibley chart speaks more to America's understanding of itself as an independent sovereign nation. Of course, like as a person with Indigenous heritage, I deeply question the sovereignty and the legitimacy of the US in and of itself. And to that point, we were talking as we were prepping for this conversation about subsumption. And one of the charts that Howland includes in the book American Astrology, which is the chart for Columbus setting sail. And that chart has the moon at 12 degrees of Sagittarius. So we're just kind of, I noticed that and was mentioning a little bit earlier that it's a little bit of an aside, and we won't talk a lot about 1492 today or at all about 1492. But it was interesting to see that the Sibley chart does root in to that voyage, which we know is so, I hate to use the word important, but fundamental rooting, a fundamental root chart for all of the colonization that came after.
Yeah, and I like that especially for like the US's understanding of itself, because like the Columbus metaphor and the Columbus myth has been so central to the US, right? As a like separate thing from Europe, like a new world. The capital, the national capital is Washington, the District of Columbia, right? The one of the ships, gosh, I think it was Vancouver, Captain George Vancouver. It was either Cook or Vancouver, whose ship was named Columbia, who was the first to discover this kind of region of the Pacific, discovered the first European who came to this, like the mouth of what's now the Columbia River, called the Columbia River, here in the Northwest. And of course, just British Columbia being to the north of me. And that's like the Columbus myth is so tied in with the US and how the US sees itself.
Massively.
So having that like as the Sibley chart, and we had a long conversation before the show that we don't need to get into about like what exactly does the Sibley chart, like what was the moment of the Sibley chart. But I think having on that day, on July 4th, having the ascendant click to that lunar position that started that voyage of Columbus, right? That I think that's significant in terms of the subsumption of what came even before this Sibley chart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can see kind of, I've thought about in the context of the Howland chart, which has a 27-degree Virgo rising. So places that Mars and Gemini near the midheaven. I've thought a lot about either way, the Mars and Gemini is this weaponization of language and how fundamental that is, particularly with the Mars-Neptune square that we see there. And we've had echoed, of course, with Neptune and Pisces instead, but we've been experiencing that this last, I was going to say a couple of years, but it's only been like 7 months or 6 months or something. Eternity of the last few months of the Mars retrograde process has been kind of echoing this moment of the weaponization of language and legal doctrines as part of that like Neptunian dissolving an erosion of the previous way of life for people. I don't know. I feel like that kind of sets us up for diving in. Did we miss anything before we jump into the chart for this university?
I think that's pretty good. The last thing that I want to note is just the Uranus position at 8 Gemini in the Sibley chart.
That's super important for the rest of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then maybe the Pluto, obviously they're in late Capricorn. We all know that. We're finishing up the Pluto return of the US right now. And then the moon, whether you use the Howland chart or the Sibley chart, the moon is in late Aquarius. In the Howland chart, I think it's at 25 Aquarius, and in the Sibley,
maybe 23, but yeah.
Yeah,
somewhere in that third decan. And I think we can also note the nodes here and just
the fixed nodes, having that north node at 6 Leo and the south node at 6 Aquarius.
And then you mentioned the Jupiterian quality of the Mercury is something that we'll see again as well.
Oh yeah, that's definitely true.
So we can kind of note
Jupiterian Mercury's in this story.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point. It's easy to think about and limit these sort of like quasi-mundane. I say quasi-mundane because we're not talking about ingress charts here, Aries ingress charts, which would be really important for world astrology or mundane astrology. But when looking at these charts, it's not just the transits. I think we also want to be thinking about the synodic cycles, and then this thing that Alex is pointing out where we've got exalted Jupiter here dispositing, or at least as the exaltation lord of Mercury, or this Jupiter-Mercury co-presence is its own type of signature. And we'll see this echoed in different signs, but it's still important to see that that Jupiter-Neptune or Jupiter-Mercury combination. Okay, so our next chart here is for the University of California, Berkeley, or UC Berkeley, as most people will know it. And this is important leading up to the event that we're talking about for this week.
Yeah, so we're bringing up the Berkeley chart here because and we'll get to the full story of this news story a little bit later, but it involves a professor at Berkeley and Berkeley's history as an institution that has a very strong anthropology department that was, built off of the study of California native cultures, particularly by Alfred Kroeber. So, yeah, what do you see in the chart? What do you see as significant jumping out? I mean, we have that, of course, we have that Jupiterian Mercury there going on in Pisces. We've got a stellium there in Pisces.
The stellium in Pisces. I'm also thinking about the fact that this now of course we can't really use the part of fortune or the ascendant because this is not a timed chart. This is just a noon chart, but I am thinking about the fact that we've got this Uranus in Cancer that's real close to America's or the US Cancer stellium, and then this Mars here, right? So it's like the Mars Uranus trine in this chart, but it's still this Mars squares the US Mars and squares the US Uranus. So just having that combination of like Mars Uranus in juxtaposition or coupled with that Jupiterian Mercury having some kind of quality of like disruptive weaponization of communication or words related to legal doctrines.
Particularly since they're on water, this like emotional kind of communication, this emotional appeal that happens. I think really significant in this chart is this Venus-Pluto conjunction. I mean, the Saturn's important too. I saw your mouse, but like first, this Venus-Pluto conjunction is wild. We have Venus and Pluto conjunct at 14 Taurus, very tight within, what is that, 16 minutes of arc that they're separating or that they're applying.
Yeah. So super tight, just on the other side of it.
This like Pluto and Taurus period was a period of, like in US history, this was the land-based colonization. This was like the taming of the Wild West in like huge, gigantic scare quotes, right? This was like a time of massive genocide. And it was the time of the intentional near extinction of the bison on the plains as a way of controlling Plains Indian people by controlling the food source. So this like Venus conjunct Taurus there, what are your thoughts on there in terms of like what Venus brings to that?
I mean, I'm thinking about Venus. So this is maybe a little bit of an aside. I know we didn't talk about this beforehand, but I've thought a bit about how much Taurus and Venus show up in the signatures of revolutionaries, particularly thinking about like Malcolm X and his like heavy Taurus signature in his chart, and thinking about the red, black, and green that he talks about, green being the land. And so like if you read his autobiography or you're familiar with his work, then it's pretty clear he's making the argument that the ability to be sovereign is predicated on having your own land. If you don't have the ability to produce your own food or have your own landedness, you can't even access any of the other aspects of sovereignty, which we definitely see for indigenous people throughout the 500 plus years of occupation. Thinking about the Venus-Pluto combination is this like corrupting of the land, corrupting of those natural resources, like you pointed out, the intentional attempt to exterminate bison as the very fabric or underpinning. Like I think about for my people, we call ourselves the people of the caribou because caribou is like my uncle jokes, what do you eat? Caribou. What do you wear? Caribou. What do you sleep in? Caribou. What are your tools made out of? Caribou. And my understanding is that for the Plains folks, that bison held a similar place, that if you take away the bison, you take away almost every part of what it means to be able to exist. And so thinking about that, Pluto being so extreme, Pluto being a planet that if we think about when Pluto was discovered, it, roughly coincides with, the Manhattan Project and the technological development of humans to be able to like kill more people or beings in one go than any other technology ever. So I think about that, and also thinking that, Uranus is there right now. We just had a bunch of eclipses, so we'll get to that a little bit later as we talk about the chronology of this, but just knowing that that's a particularly sensitive part of the chart. And if we're thinking about, the Sibley chart, that's the 6th house of the US. So there's something there about eradicating the means of sovereignty being something that sets up the conditions of slavery or wage slavery or subjugation. I know it's a little directing it in a different to a different place, but I'm curious about your thoughts on the Saturn in Sagittarius there.
Yeah, the Saturn and Sag is so interesting. I mean, of course, it's like on the Sibley chart's ascendant, right? It's opposite the Sibley chart's Uranus, and we're going to get to the synastry in more detail, but just like the Saturn is so important in terms of what it's doing here in Berkeley's chart. Especially the anthropology department at Berkeley has, from its earliest beginning, it made its reputation on, as I said, Native cultures, and on being the expert, on having the museum, on having all of the artifacts, right? Like the museum at Berkeley became the repository for all of the artifacts, similar to the Smithsonian on a national level. So we have this connection, this like Sagittarian, I mean, I just love like Austin Coppock, like referring to Sagittarius as the cowboy, right? This like energy that like goes out and like expands and wants to like survey the land and like see these great expanses and like all of this is mine. Saturn in that place brings a sort of authority and a sort of like a long-lasting institution that is that repository for that national like heritage, that national story, right? Which is the Sagittarian story that the United States tells about itself is a particular narrative, and there are other narratives that are maybe more compelling, we could argue. But the Sagittarian narrative is institutionalized with Saturn there, especially Saturn on the ascendant of the Sibley chart.
Yeah, absolutely. And just thinking about like, from the perspective of the Sibley chart, this Pisces stellium landing in the 4th, thinking about Jupiter, from the Sibley chart's perspective, Jupiter is the, to borrow a turn of phrase from Ali Olomi's translations, the guardian of the US chart, right? And so if we're taking Jupiter here in the 4th of the Sibley chart, and I guess this is a good time as any to hop over to that bi-wheel. And so we can see this inner ring, the US Sibley chart, and then UC Berkeley's chart on the outer ring here. And when we look at it this way,
we're a little laggy.
We're a little laggy. Okay. Not sure what we can do about that besides just slow down a bit.
I think it's all right. I think we can, visualize the Sagittarius rising, the Saturn on the ascendant, all those Pisces planets in the 4th sign.
Yeah.
And even the sun here, the sun is on the IC of the Sibley chart. The Sibley chart's IC is at 1 Aries in the 5th sign.
Yeah, thinking about that, this moon, I mean, the Jupiter is opposing that Neptune too. And one of the things I noticed or noted in my presentation at ESAR last summer, talking about the, making mythologies talk with Jupiter and Neptune cycle, was that the Jupiter Neptune cycle seems to be pretty tightly interwoven into the story of the US. Particularly if you think about that, if we're thinking about manifest destiny, if we're thinking about like just that as an archetypal idea, there is something of this Neptunian, it's our destiny, it's fated, it's this like glorious mythology around expansion. Certainly looking at the way the Corps of Discovery or the Lewis and Clark expedition happened. In my ESAR talk, I talked about the way that, and also in the February forecast on the Astrology podcast, I mentioned this in response to something Austin said about manifest destiny is kind of functioning as this like tidal wave of destruction, but also this sort of like tidal wave of legal deception, Jupiter, legal, Neptune, deception or confusion or murkiness. So kind of like seeing that combination of things erode away in some really significant ways. Not sure. So yeah, seeing this kind of Jupiter opposition to the US Neptune, I think we see that picking up, and we can also see it as we zoom ahead to this year. Is there anything else we want to dwell on with this before we talk about our professor and the news story?
Yeah. The last thing I think with this chart is just kind of quick and dirty rectification. It's a university. We don't have the time of when it opened. We have a couple different options in terms of just like common sense. So either it opened in the morning at like a regular business time, or there was like a ceremony at some point in the day, and that's when they like cut a ribbon and said that it was open. So we don't know which one of those it was, but if it was open at like beginning of the day, it would either be Aries rising or Taurus rising. The Taurus rising, like 8 a.m. is Taurus rising. I think 7, I don't remember if 7 was Taurus or Aries, but like if it opened at the beginning of the day, we kind of have 2 possible rising signs. And I think, I don't know, Taurus rising is interesting for an institution that has been so long lasting and so important in like the peace movement and the like student movement that happened in the 60s and 70s. For this kind of like institution that's so centered around activism but towards peace,
seemingly, yeah.
Seemingly.
I say that having lived in, I didn't go to Cal, but I lived in the student co-ops around UC Berkeley, and most of my housemates were Cal students. The vast majority of my friends are Cal alum. And I definitely attended a number of protests on campus, and the institution itself is much more plutocratic, I think, than people like to think. Also having done some construction accounting, and for a general contractor that's done some work for the UC Office of the President, there's Pluto level of money, or kind of more publicly known things. The amount of money that the Cal football coach makes is enough to fund a very, very robust scholarship program. So if we think about some of that type of like plutocracy, tight control of wealth, we can see that. And in terms of the rectification, yeah, that Uranus-Pluto conjunction would have been co-present with the node. So if one wanted to try to rectify the chart for UC Berkeley, kind of thinking about those, any of the Virgo Pisces eclipses should be able to get some angularity. But it's interesting, just kind of noting the 12 noon time thrown up here, that would give us midday. All right, cool. If there was a midday ceremony, then we still end up with both Aries and Cancer angular. And it's interesting to think perhaps in a few years, some stuff with Neptune returning to Aries will give us some more idea about whether the Aries is the ascending angle or the culminating angle for the chart, because it seems like something like that would certainly track, especially in light of UC Berkeley being one of the top ranked American public institutions. Certainly like Stanford is local, and there's other private schools that are more prestigious. But even like if we think about Facebook, I think Cal was one of the first non-Ivy and definitely one of the first public universities back when you needed a .edu. Initially, you needed to be an Ivy League, have an Ivy League.edu to get a Facebook account. And then it was, I think, 2005 or 6, they opened it up to Stanford and Cal students. And Cal students were like the first public school college students who were allowed to have a Facebook account way back in ancient history. But that's a bit of a aside, but maybe that's a bit of an argument for this Cancer ascendant tying into the the US sun.
Hmm.
Our intrepid professor.
Yeah, I think we're ready to bring him up.
All
And
right.
I think this is the point where we tell the story, right? Of
Yeah.
what happened. Who's this guy? Why do we even care about this guy? Do you have it pulled up right now? We're kind of lagged and it's not
Oh, you can't see
showing on the
it?
screen. No, you
Interesting.
might want to like stop sharing your screen and then start it again.
Okay, let's
See
see.
if that'll like clear the screen and bring it back up.
Maybe. Okay. Please don't boot us out of the Zoom room. Screen share is loading.
Tim White, there we go.
Hey, all right.
Yeah, so this guy, Professor Tim White, was a longtime professor of evolutionary biology, and he taught in the anthropology department at UC Berkeley. He's now a professor emeritus. He's retired, so he taught for decades. I think he started teaching in 1977, and his last year was, I think, 2021. Sometime in the last couple of years as we record this.
Mhm.
So this guy's a Virgo sun, opposite Jupiter in Pisces, Saturn in Virgo, Mercury in Virgo, South Node in Virgo.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot going on here.
And Pluto sharing a sign.
Yep. There's that 8-degree Cancer Uranus. Oh yeah, is that exact? I don't think that made it into our notes, but I think that's almost an exact Uranus return for Cal.
Mm.
If we bounce back to, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
8 degrees 48
Mm-hmm.
minutes. And 8 degrees 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm. So the issue that happened, we started having this conversation because a news article came out on ProPublica on Monday that's referencing this professor and is referencing Berkeley. And the article said essentially that the professor has been using human skeletal remains for decades. You know, since he entered the department, he's been using the department's collection of human skeletal remains in his evolutionary biology courses. These remains are unprovenanced, which means that we don't know where they came from. Their sources are not listed. Like, where were they dug up? It's unknown. That's what unprovenanced means. So Tim White argues that because the remains are unprovenanced, they do not fall under the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which requires institutions to return human remains to tribes that they come from. Tim White also argues that because the human remains are unprovenanced and they're dated to be thousands of years old, that it's impossible to actually connect these specific remains to a specific tribe, right? So this guy's having a bunch of drama with NAGPRA, and the institution is having a bunch of drama with NAGPRA.
Mhm. Should we jump ahead to NAGPRA and help folks understand what
Yeah,
that's
and
about?
then we
Or should
can come
talk?
back to this chart and see how he like
Okay.
really fits into it and see how Berkeley fits into it.
Okay, so let me jump ahead to this chart. Okay. Did the screen come with us? Are you seeing
It
what I'm
did
seeing?
indeed.
Okay. So here we have the chart for NAGPRA. I mean, already we see a couple of interesting things with this, like Mars here. Of course, like we're all very familiar with Mars being retrograde around this degree. Probably don't want to see that right now. And of course, we don't have an exact time, so we can't look at this like ascendant that seems as if it's on the US moon, or the midheaven that seems like it's on the US ascendant. But this Mercury Mars opposition definitely gets us rooted and gets us some subsumption.
So we have Mercury on the Sibley charts ascendant. We have Mars retrograde and conjunct the Sibley charts Uranus on the descendant.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really powerful opposition.
Yeah. Yeah, especially thinking about the fact that this Mars is dispositing the moon Pluto conjunction there at 17 Scorpio. And then even though it's not as exact, and it's so like the moon Pluto conjunction here is nearly 3 degrees separating, but close to opposite from that Venus Pluto conjunction we saw for Cal. Definitely that Pluto opposition for Cal, which I think is significant if we think about, as we were talking before, you were mentioning how much, Kroeber, how significant Kroeber is to anthropology, how significant Cal's anthropology department and museum are to its institutional legacy, and I guess stature even today. And so if we think about Pluto as a planet symbolizing wealth, Pluto representing petroleum as a source of wealth, Pluto representing literally like these corrupt, in the sense that they're stolen remains, that that Pluto, we can't make it, we can't house it, but I think we can certainly think about that.
We can put it in the Sibley charts houses, right?
That's true. We can't put it in
Taurus
the houses.
in the Sibley chart is in the 6th house. That Scorpio is in the 12th house. We have this like deep like moral emotional qualm with the past, that part of what NAGPRA is doing is trying to like answer to that, and trying to like bring this like Venusian quality of like healing, detrimented, like it's a struggle, but trying as much as possible to bring some peace to the kind of 12th house hidden stuff nobody wants to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about where the bones come from. It's just like a kind of that conversation that people want to stay in the 12th house.
Yeah.
But one thing I really like about this chart, about the NAGPRA chart, is the Saturn, Uranus, Neptune thing going on in Capricorn there. I think this is just an excellent example of how, even more broadly, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the early 90s, how that really reframed cultural stories around the past. Like this is the time when just so much was being done in terms of like what conservatives have called like cultural revisionism or whatever. And what happened there was that history was told from the perspective of like the white male conquerors for hundreds of years. And then, at a period with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in the 60s, and then with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in the 90s, there was like a revision of that and saying like, no, it's actually not just the story of George Washington that matters. It's also the story of everyone else. And here's a more full and complete understanding of all of our history together. So I think this like NAGPRA as almost like answering to that, especially like in the Sibley, the 2nd house of the Sibley chart, like literal resources, right? Like movable. They're not resources, but like they're used as resources, right? By Berkeley, as uncomfortable and horrific as that is.
Yeah, thinking about that, and even like this, I know it's a little bit wide, but this Saturn is pretty close to the Pluto, the natal Pluto for the US. So just thinking about how,
and opposite the rest of the Cancer stuff.
Yeah, so it's like there's this Uranus opposing this Jupiter most closely, almost to the degree. I guess we can also pull that up. I know we're going a little bit out of order from what we talked about. Do you want to loop back and look at Professor and Cal, or do you want to look at NAGPRA in the US next?
I think one last thing before we leave this chart, going back to this Mercury-Mars opposition, I think like the particular combination of like, you had mentioned our like pre-show chat about Mars and Gemini, especially the retrograde, as like weaponizing language
Mhm,
and as like words as weapons.
mhm,
And when that's answering to an opposite to a Mercury that's so like confused, like a Mercury that has a mission and knows like what's good and right, but doesn't necessarily have the specific words to do that, doesn't have the specific procedures because it's in Sag. It knows broadly ancestral remains should be returned to the people
mhm,
for whom they are the ancestors, right? Like that seems like obvious and true and like a good thing to do, right?
mhm.
But then the specifics of like, okay, but how do you do that when there are bones in this museum in California that have been there for 150 years and they're 9,000 years old? And also the tribes in there was just a massive genocide in California, like a very intense, violent, quick genocide in
Mhm.
California. Um, how do you find who those remains should go to, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
so
mean,
I think
even
this like level of confusion is present in this opposition.
there's definitely a level of confusion, and even the like the quality of the, how do we say it, the necessity of moving through technicalities and creating much more clarity, especially thinking about, this Mercury Mars opposition is mutually applying because Mars is
Yeah,
retrograde. So it's like it's happening really quick. Mercury's out of bounds in this chart and moving fast, a degree and a half a day, right? So it's like Mercury's moving at 100, like 50% faster than normal. Um, and there's even something here. Was I thinking about this? There's like a few little things like in this chart, particular Saturn's Antisha, that Mercury.
mm,
So even though they seem like they're not doing much, like they certainly are. And so it's like, okay, well, if that Saturn's Antisha to Mercury, and we know that this whole like this triple conjunction, and especially in terms of subsumption and thinking about those synodic cycles, this Neptune, what the Neptune Uranus cycle is 171 years. So we go back to the previous one in 1821 at 3 degrees of Capricorn. Um, so thinking about this like NAGPRA happening so soon after this conjunction, um, or so soon before this conjunction
or
is
it's still
really like,
applying.
yeah, before,
Mhm.
but being so close that it's like NAGPRA really is part of closing this previous chapter and opening a new chapter of, I think, I mean, you're the one with the historical training, not me. But from what I understand, NAGPRA and then some of the stuff that comes just after it is really part of turning, like changing a lot of, maybe not the like nation to nation part of the relationship between indigenous folks in the US, but more of the like ground level grassroots, so to speak, like level of being able to have access to your cultural artifacts. So like prior to NAGPRA, it didn't matter if some museum had your shit and you knew about it. There was no recourse. So
Mhm.
even though there's this like muddiness of the Mercury where like without provenance, you can't tie remains to a specific group of people. So even if like we were talking in the pre-show that Cal was founded in the 1860s, it was well after the missions. Like there should be a way to at least rule out the vast majority of other California tribes and nations. Um, but that's immaterial to the point of the law, which requires a very specific type of proving that these come from your people in order to engage that legal structure, that legal recourse. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think we can pull up the Sibley chart in NAGPRA now and see how um, NAGPRA fits into that kind of US mission. I think that like that 1821 Uranus Neptune conjunction is really interesting. I'm working on a longer piece about um, the the Whitman mission in what's now considered to be Washington State, as well as like the Oregon Trail. There's like a big story around that in like the 1830s, 1840s. But in 1821, what was happening was the Second Great Awakening, which is this huge religious revival that was happening, evangelical kind of tent revivals, right? That spurred this like missionizing effort where like missionaries started going out and converting native people, but also going all over the world. But this is a lot of the like quote unquote first contact with tribes in the West started happening at that point after the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. So it's like opening up the like Western settlement thing and the religious foundation for the settlement of the West. Started with the 1821 Uranus-Neptune conjunction and the religious ideals that came with that. And then now what happened in the early 90s, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, was this more culturally broad throughout the United States, throughout people of various different backgrounds. Many different people started getting into, there's not a single word for it, but some form of alternative spirituality, whether that's like earth-based paganism, witchcraft, ecological kind of spirituality. A lot of Native people started reconnecting with their own cultures at this point. It's mirrored in like every single type of community. There was this kind of change of religious ideals that I think is evident here in NAGPRA, where with the 1821 Uranus-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn, and most of that they were co-present in Sagittarius, and they were very close in Sagittarius before they actually hit Capricorn. It gave birth to this evangelical, and what I mean by evangelical is like an outward form of Christianity that wants to convert, wants to convert other people to your ideas and your way of life, or the missionaries, ideas and way of life. Where the Uranus-Neptune conjunction that happened in the early 1990s seems, we're still close to it, so it's hard to say 100% what its historical legacy is, but much more of this like multicultural, intercultural understanding kind of thing, like we're all humanity, tolerance kind of vibes came in with this 1990 thing. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of like NAGPRA, among other things. There were other things that happened at this time as well, but NAGPRA represents the closing of that last chapter that opened in the 1820s and a new chapter of, we could call it intercultural relations, but essentially like what's happening with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction is ideology. It's a change in ideology, like a radical reimagination of how we think the world works. And we're seeing now, since the 1990s, we're in a different understanding than what came before that.
100%, yeah. Even thinking about this, like this Uranus-Neptune conjunction, and thinking about the degrees, maybe this is a really good example of something that Georgia Stathis kind of lays out in her Pushing Through Time book, that it's not just about the exact conjunction or the phase per se. If we look at the degrees, both Uranus and Neptune have moved past the previous conjunction. So even though they haven't formed the next one, we're still past it. And so this like early 90s up until 93 is still post the 1821 flavor, but not quite yet into the new one. And having some vague memory of this time period, it's like, I've got a like book of Native American fairy tales that my grandmother gave me when I was a kid. And looking at that, I'm like, this is like atrocious. By today's standards, that book is so inappropriate and so offensive. But by those standards, that book was like so radical, so fucking different. Yeah, like the representation in that's just
too.
Oh God,
the Disney movie Pocahontas came out at this time.
Oh
shit. In the 90s.
Oh wow, yeah, we're coming up on the Saturn return of that damn movie.
I got really sick at NORWAC. I didn't get sick at NORWAC. I should change that.
Because
but
somebody tried to play Pocahontas and got all Disney princess?
No, I got a bout of fatigue is what happened. I just like lost all my energy on Saturday night, and then I took a nap and I was fine. But I was like I was in the hotel room and Pocahontas was on the TV. And when my friends came in and was like, you must be sick. Like everyone thought I had COVID, but I didn't. But because I was watching Pocahontas. And I'm like, it's a cultural show. I watched it a lot when I was a kid. Like it is what it is, you know?
It's true. I mean, that was like the one, like
Yeah,
that
the only
was
one.
because Dances with Wolves was too adult and also not cool. Oh man. Okay, yes, cultural moments. We should bring it back in. We talked about Uranus. We talked about Neptune too much. We talked about Neptune so much I confused the
We got
planets.
far into Neptune. We started talking about movies.
Oh God.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Neptune's opposing the US sun, which I think is really interesting. There's something about that, like dissolving that like core ego identity that the US has.
And like softening it, and like because for so long the US has had this like perception of itself as like big, like Teddy Roosevelt, like muscular, like whatever, right? Like
yeah,
muscular nationality, like I'm gonna do a bunch of push-ups to make America great, like I don't know.
Rough
um
Riders.
yeah, but like there was like this
The
moment in the
original Rough
90s
Riders.
where
For
it was
those of you who
like,
don't know, that's Teddy Roosevelt and has to do with the Spanish American War, not DMX. Okay. Sorry.
indeed. What were we saying? Oh, like I think this was a moment where it was like the idea of what it means to be an American softened. This was like the moment where, like, I mean, like I said, like tolerance was like one of the like keywords of this like early time period, I think, of the early 90s.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the
In terms of like intercultural relations and diversity, like as a broad concept. Like, is it good to have people of different ideas around? Right. And I
Mhm.
think in this time period it became like, yes, it's not as threatening to the United States like sense of self. um,
Yeah,
in this time
yeah.
period there's an idea that like the inclusion into the melting pot makes the United States stronger.
Mhm. Oh yeah, that was definitely a big period of, especially if we contrast it with what we are living through now in our general hostility towards immigration. It was a period where at least like the propaganda that we were pumping out as a nation was saying that like we welcome people, you can come here, we're like this is the place you would want to come, where everybody's welcome and where like everyone's ideas or cultures are respected or honored, which is just ludicrous to think because it's so not actually how it is.
Right, right. I
Okay.
think the Scorpio stuff in this chart is interesting in terms of how it trines those Cancer placements in the Sibley chart.
Mhm.
So in the NAGPRA chart, we have the 4 planets in Scorpio, and then in the Sibley chart, we have 4 planets in the lot of fortune in Cancer. So there's this like emotive um feeling sense kind of underlying it.
Mhm. Mhm. I think in terms of our conversation tonight, one thing that I think is important to draw out is that this Moon Pluto conjunction and this like dead set middle of the fixed signs remains important, especially since we've got the like Jupiter Pluto square here. Um, and then the last thing I wanted to mention about this is that though it's a bit wide still, Pluto is moving fast through Scorpio. And so we've got this like closing or waning crescent phase, basically. Natal, right? So this Pluto here, we're like winding down and approaching the last phase before the US Pluto return, which we're in the moment.
Which we're in
Yeah.
at the moment as we actually come in on the story, which is really interesting. And like that makes me wonder, like projecting this into the future, like I wonder what's going to happen when Pluto goes into Aquarius. It's going to go into Aquarius for a couple of months this year.
Mhm.
But that's still early compared to everything that's going on in these charts that we're talking about. So I
Except
wonder,
for the nodes for NAGPRA itself, right? And then the 2020, the last, so if we're talking about subsumption and these like synodic cycles, then the last Jupiter Saturn cycle was exactly there where this NAGPRA node is. Okay.
And yep.
Which one next? Do you want to go US Cal Professor, US Cal NAGPRA?
Let's maybe do Cal Professor,
Cal Professor.
and then we can start adding in the other charts.
Go back to Cal.
So that's NAGPRA itself, and how it relates to the US.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have this professor, and this professor comes from before NAGPRA. Obviously, NAGPRA is like more recent than he is, right? So he was already a professor at Cal when NAGPRA came out.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to go to the tri-whale?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Okay.
So, I mean, one thing that's really interesting with this professor in particular is that he was born at the Uranus return of the institution itself. So his Uranian self is matched up equally with his institution. So part of the doctrine of subsumption is that the root charts that you exist within affect your ability to do your own chart. Like, it affects your chart's ability to operate. So a professor working for an institution where their Uranus matches means that the professor would be supported in terms of those Uranian qualities that are there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, almost like the university is acting through him. Like, this isn't necessarily like something that like he just went off and did by himself. Like, no, like he like used these skeletal remains for decades with the full knowledge of the university, right? Like everyone knew this was happening. And now, especially from the article, it kind of seems like everybody's trying to pin it on him, partly because he's holding out. He's like really arguing that what he did was right and that there's no problem with it. And like, what's the big deal? He says that they can't return the remains anyway because there's no way to know who to return them to. So what's the big deal? And it feels almost like, while at the same time, the university administrators have publicly apologized to local tribes for, the practice of using skeletal remains and for housing those remains. Like, they've apologized for that. And so you have the administration of the university on the one hand apologizing, and then you have the professors still defending these types of actions, where his defense of those actions actually represents what's been happening at the university on a longer time scale. It's almost like the professor just like missed the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, like missed the Saturn-Uranus, Saturn-Neptune stuff. He just like didn't. I mean, obviously he did live through it, but it just seems like he didn't really, and maybe didn't change him the way that it needed to.
Yeah, I mean, looking at his chart, it's interesting. Thinking about like, okay, so here's his Neptune on this outer ring. On the US, right? Inner ring is the US Saturn. His Saturn near the US Neptune. So there's this like weird, I've thought of the combination. Go ahead.
The Neptune of Berkeley is an Aries opposite.
Yeah, so it's like
14,
this like
15.
opposite ideology. This opposite ideology that comes down and still like strongly pulls in institution, history, like structure. There's something very all of those things about Saturn. But also thinking, and granted, this like moon for Cal could be a few degrees in either direction, but this node is still going to be quite close to the moon, certainly close to that Jupiter. His own Jupiter is like whole sign return, but not quite exactly lined up with the institutions. But even just thinking about the way that his chart picks up Cal's chart.
And his sun is on Cal's north node. His Jupiter is on Cal's south node.
Yeah, so there's something there.
And just, I mean, honestly, like the Sun-Jupiter opposition itself, like Sun in Virgo, there's great things about the Sun in Virgo, but it can be kind of pedantic sometimes. And And like opposite Jupiter and Pisces, I feel like there's a danger of arrogance. It's like one possibility there of like, I've been doing this so long that why should I have to listen to you? Why should I have to change anything when everything's going so great?
Yeah, I think Jupiter can show that type of arrogance, and like arrogant, self-aggrandizing, like haughtiness and imperiousness. I feel like maybe imperious is really the money word for me, thinking about Jupiter. Also Jupiter in Cancer, right, which the US has. So there's this quality of like domicile Jupiter, don't give a fuck. There's this exalted Saturn, right? Same quality of like, I'm not accountable to anyone else or anything else. I'll decide for myself. Thank you. Maybe
I think there's
something
also a
too.
level with the way that Tim White's chart interacts with Cal, like with his Jupiter on Cal's south node. I wonder if Cal has kind of actually reined it in. Like, I wonder if the institution actually like decreases the self-aggrandizement we might see might be decreased from its natural levels.
Yeah, there is a certain amount of still having to like conform to the institution, and it's, you know, it's interesting that in the context of this article and even in Professor Tim White's response, it's not that he's saying that NAGPRA has no standing or is invalid. It's that he's saying that with remains of unknown provenance, it is not possible, given forensic science, to be able to comply or to be able to accurately determine the precise, and again, you know, that brings us back to NAGPRA itself, the like Mars retrograde in Gemini, and mutually applying to that opposition with Mercury in detriment. Although Mercury does have its own decan, so there's maybe even this quality of like believing that the message is clear, believing that like it got done, it was relatively quick, particularly for something that would be good for Indigenous people in some way, presumably. Typically the US seems to like resist that sort of stuff. So we could see some of those like Mercury first decan Sag qualities, but it's also muddy in the sense that, you know, from what my partner has studied forensic anthropology and worked with human remains, and from what they've shared, it is true to a certain extent that it's not possible short of like a DNA match to be able to definitively say that this particular set of remains that we don't have a precise location for, like once you remove the remains from their provenance and from any other like artifacts that would help to identify time and place, then you do have this instance where, you know, I don't know. I think about like my people being nomadic and having basically the whole interior of Alaska. How are you going to determine some remains found in the vast interior of Alaska and say that this is, oh, were these remains from people who are in Manly Village now or in Minto Village or up the road in Rampart? Like, you can't. And even with some of the issues we were talking about earlier, you know, for some of the remains where there is more of an idea with the institutions that hold them, like University Knoxville or University Tennessee Knoxville and the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, there's also a limit in the capacity of some of the tribes and nations to perform the appropriate ceremonies and rituals to receive back, to actually have the repatriation happen. Like, you know, how would a small group of people go about appropriately receiving thousands of remains
when you need to individually bury each one with honor and dignity?
Yeah. Yeah, and
I
who
think
knows what
like
other politics, like in terms of like families and clans, and I don't even know how any of those, like, you know, cousins fight regardless of other stuff when you make it about something it's like important and sacred and emotional as ancestors and cultural ways. I could see that being creating whole different levels of intra-tribal conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we saw that in Northwest with Kennewick Man, right, where an ancient skeletal remain was identified near the Tri-Cities in Washington State, and it was just held in the Birth Museum at the University of Washington for years because they couldn't figure out, well, for a number of reasons, but like partly because the anthropologists wanted to keep it, but there were like 3 possible tribes that it could go to, right? Because the people of the area that's now the Tri-Cities in Washington were removed from their land, and some of them were put on the Colville Reservation, some of them were put on the Warm Springs Reservation, and some on the Yakima. So it's like you have 3 tribes who are all saying this is our ancestor, and it's like very well could be all of the ancestor, you know, like who knows. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, getting into that, like if it were possible to use DNA evidence to be able to exactly pinpoint, okay, this like this set of remains is the ancestor of one of these living people. Okay, which one of your like many like ancestors was
Like,
this
and they're
person
all
related to?
related.
How many? Yeah, exactly. You know, especially with really small groups of people, I kind of laugh where I'm like, yeah, my band of, you mean the 13 bands of people who didn't have more than like 40 people in any one band? Like, we're all cousin, literally. You know, the first time I go to the village, my grandma's like, everybody here is your cousin. Everyone on the other side of the river is your cousin too. So yeah, like, and our 13 different families do have some disagreements. I think we would be hard pressed, even with a small number of people, to like come to a quick consensus that would satisfy the types of legal requirements that would facilitate that process of repatriation. And it's like again and again we go to this, like, the technicalities of legal doctrines, the technicality of the language, the weaponization of those legal doctrines, in the same way that many different indigenous groups have talked about the way that blood quantum is not inherent or culturally consistent, but is a mechanism that is there in the law that makes it so that a lot of people who are indigenous don't have any legal standing. And that's just part of accelerating the rate at which there are no native people who have legal ties or legal claim to sovereignty and like you know, intergovernmental relations.
Right, literally like writing Indians out of existence, like eventually
Yeah,
throughout the number of generations.
yeah. I'm assuming that's why Alaskan Natives have corporations instead of reservations.
Mhm. Yeah,
Let's see here. We talked U.S. Cal
I
NAGPRA.
think I think the we don't have to necessarily pull it up, but just the NAGPRA Saturn, Uranus, Neptune interact in Capricorn, interacting with the US Pluto and opposite the Cancer stellium. At least in the Sibley chart, the Cancer stellium is in the 8th house. I think there's something about like what's mine and what's ours, what's mine and what's yours.
Mm-hmm.
Like who do these belong to? And the 2nd house being like movable. It's so interesting because like the 4th house is like land and like immovable real estate, like the stuff that you can't take off the property once you sell the property, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a grave should be part of that, right? Like a grave should be untouched. Like you don't touch it, it stays there, it stays in the 4th house. But instead they like dug up this 4th house, brought it into the 2nd house, made it like the property of this institution, made it a resource and a tool, which is horrific, like in the way that Pluto is horrific.
Mm-hmm.
And this Saturn, Uranus, Neptune thing coming in and like understanding that and seeking to redress it. I think there's a
Mm-hmm.
level of the new way of seeing the world that came with the Uranus Neptune conjunction being made real with Saturn there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something about that. I think any of the Saturn Neptune especially the conjunctions, and you know, we noted that with the combination of the synastry with, I think it's 6-2, that's Cal NAGPRA, so it's this, no, not NAGPRA, with Tim White here, where we've got this like Neptune, Saturn, his Neptune, Cal's Neptune, the US Saturn, or his Saturn, the US Neptune. And then, I mean, Cal Saturn is still like making the square. Yeah. And then Neptune right now opposing, right? And Neptune right now is like on his between his Jupiter and Moon.
That's Cal.
Or sorry, Cal's Jupiter and Moon near Professor Tim White's nodal axis. If we use the Howland chart, which I'm partial to, then Tim White's nodal axis falls on the US ascendant. So I think either way, we see this interesting combination of like angularity and this Neptune idealism, ideology in some ways. But when Saturn gets involved, it's like this extreme disillusionment, making the dream real, and this like both at the same time. The reality of the dream being threatened or murdered, Saturn coming in and killing the dream in some ways, or like maybe we could say in this, right, where we're looking at NAGPRA, Cal in the US, or we could even just look at which one is it? There's two. NAGPRA in the US is 5 and 2. If we're looking at it this way, right, where it's like we get this combination of Saturn, Neptune. It's like Saturn had just recently come in maybe and killed this like illusion or dream that existed in some way. Maybe the disrupted dream from the previous like 1821 conjunction. But really thinking about, since we can trust the houses with the Sibley chart, you know, Jupiter, L4, transiting the 9th. So it's like literally making teaching examples out of the dead bodies. And we see that again and again, even, you know, part of the package, I want to say it was like 8 different little laws that were clustered together with NAGPRA. Part of that is what founded the Smithsonian's Native American Museum, or Native American Museum, the one that has, you know, some million odd artifacts, many of which you would presume could be repatriated under NAGPRA, but aren't, because it's a teaching museum.
Is there an exception for that in NAGPRA?
I'd have to actually go through and look at the whole text of the bill. I don't recall there being a teaching exemption, but it is very specific that if the provenance is unknown, then like you have to be able to prove that that artifact comes from your people. And I think the way that it's written, it also needs to NAGPRA assigned several implementation responsibilities to the Secretary of the Interior, which includes extending inventory deadlines for museums that demonstrate a good faith effort. So it's like there, yeah, and there's even more recent stuff. If we go to like 2004, we can see some Ninth Circuit, more recent like appeals related to it. But basically, from what I gathered, if there is no proof of provenance, then there is no claim under NAGPRA, which is part of why Professor Tim White saying that it's that it is not possible scientifically to determine that remains are the remains of indigenous people is so significant, because it's not precisely true. Although there is no legal precedent established for being able to race human remains, which is where we again get into like these technicalities. There's a difference between what is scientifically possible and what has the combination of like medical legal precedent.
It's so Neptunian because it's like race doesn't exist, right?
Exactly.
Like it's not biological. It's not something like you can't like determine from
Except
people's
there are
bones, right?
some, but there are some bone markers that are
Yeah.
definitely statistically correlated to specific populations, and there are a few that Native Americans and Pacific Islanders in particular have, my understanding,
Well,
is some of the more like statistically significant bone markers that are quite exclusive to different geographic populations. That's different than race, that's different than ethnicity. Which is where
different
we
than
get
nation.
into, yeah. It's where we get into this whole like interesting Mars, Neptune, Mercury mutable combination of things. It's not always that exact that exact thing here. It's like, well, we get the Jupiter plus Mercury, which kind of has a similar flavor. I'm not doing the ABCs, and yet
Mhm.
Jupiter plus Neptune is bringing in these opposite planets in the same way that the mutable angles would bring in the rulership of opposite planets. We do have this like site, at least between Jupiter and Neptune, more specifically between Neptune and Mercury here,
Mhm.
with Mercury squaring that Neptune. So even though like Mercury, Mercury and Mars don't have line of sight to each other, we do still have like the configuration of all of those planets coming together.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think getting back to what you were saying about like trying to like the provenance of the skeletal remains, like that came up in the Kennewick Man controversy, because the scientists or the anthropologists, I don't remember, were saying that these remains were actually not Native American, like at all. It's like period, were not Native American, and they were like trying to argue that they were Amerindian, like some pre-Native American, non-Native American, like a group of people who were not biologically related to the people we know as Native Americans. They were like a separate group. It's just like really silly. I haven't heard this argument very much besides the Kennewick Man case. I think it was more in this like the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There were all these like within the field of anthropology, there were all these ideas about like the races and how the races developed, right? And there was the
Mhm.
like idea that humanity evolved separately, right? And that's why the races exist. Um, but anyway, there was this like anthropological idea that I don't know, like I don't know if like in the academic theory, I don't know if they just thought that all these people from this culture just like died out or something. I'm not sure, but there was like some argument that like Kennewick Man, who's referred to as the ancient ones by like the mid Columbia people, um, that he's like not biologically related to the people of the area that he was found in for whatever reason.
I mean, I don't want
Like
to
it's
get,
just it's super
yeah.
messy. Like it's Neptunian, right? It's these like boundaries that don't exist and that people try to shift to, particularly those in power, try to shift towards their own ends, because the goal of that, like the scientists' goal of that rhetorical strategy was to hang on to the remains, right? They want to hold on to the remains so they can test them, use them in classes, like they want to keep them, and like that's why they're doing their whole rhetorical strategy.
Yeah, and if we even go back a step further and think about some of the initial precedent, to bring it back to the fundamental conversation we're having here, which is about subsumption. Howland makes this argument that you want to root the US in the coronation of William the Conqueror, which sets up England, or and he lays out a bunch of charts, many of which predate 1776, and some of them include Columbus setting sail, Columbus first sighting, quote, the New World, the various charters, Sir Walter Raleigh attempting to colonize the New World, and if we look at, the Virginia Charter being the first successful charter that paves the way for the installation of the colonies, we get this like for-profit capitalist venture, which part of which the common law precedent is predicated on there are no people with any legal claim to the land that exist. So it's important for the US, it's important for anthropologists in those early times to say there were no real people who were here. That ancestor, it's not an ancestor of these people, because that would give them some sort of claim to being landed here. That might negate, I know it's doctrine of discovery more north, and that we use some different language to south of the US Canadian border, but it's essentially the same thing, that doctrine of discovery, or the presupposition
Doctrine
that
of discovery is used in the US too.
Yeah,
The doctrine of discovery has been explicitly used by the US Supreme Court.
Okay, I thought there was like some specific other phrase that was used early on, but either way.
Oh, I'm sure there is, but the doctrine of discovery is like, that's from the Pope.
Yeah.
Like that, like the legal claim that the US holds to the land is the doctrine of discovery, and it's the Supreme Court references the papal law on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So
in terms of the Pope laying down between Spain and Portugal that whichever European power lands on, a piece of land that's not already claimed by European power, the first European power to land is the one who gets claim to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because like the rights of indigenous people don't count in this system, right?
Only it's something about
Christians. I mean, I think like
having,
in terms of
God.
his language, he would have said it's just like Christians.
Yeah. And so if we think about Neptune, or the combination of Neptune and Jupiter, I think more to the point than whether we talk about Jupiter-Neptune conjunctions going back, or we talk about Jupiter-Neptune transits in their cycles. I think we still see this combination of like Jupiter, legal doctrine, Neptune, confusion, deception, religion, ideology, Saturn coming in and making permanent, setting in stone, or setting in legal doctrine and legal precedent, institutionalizing those things. And we can see like different variations of this showing up again and again. But in the interest of time, I want to maybe bring us to
one last thing I want to say about this chart,
if
I may.
Yes.
So in the NAGPRA chart, and keep up what you have here. In the NAGPRA chart, Mars is retrograde at 9 degrees of Gemini. Mars actually stationed direct. It went back into Taurus and stationed direct at 27 Taurus, which is opposite Venus. So NAGPRA gets signed, and then like a week or two later, Mars stations direct opposite the Venus in the signing chart. So it would have been like a major turning point. Like, I wonder if that was the moment when they started to look at the law and say like, hold on, how do we do this? How do we actually try to do this with integrity? And that's in a trine, right, to the US Pluto, or yeah, like the Mars station was in a trine to the US Pluto. That Venus in the NAGPRA chart is in a sextile to the US Pluto.
And this is kind of like,
I mean, literally digging up bones.
Yeah, literally digging up bones. And I'm looking at my little chart that I made for myself of all these different synodic cycles. And 1942, we had the Saturn-Uranus conjunction at 29 degrees Taurus. And then 1947, we had, that would have been the Saturn-Neptune, it looks like. No, that would be the Saturn-Pluto at 13 degrees of Leo. So there's our 13 degrees of Leo up here. There's Jupiter. That like retrograde Mars would have been really close to the 42. And I was just thinking about those two because of the code talkers, the Dene, or the Navajo folks, and their like really important role in World War II. And just thinking about like World War II, roughly it's before like the 60s scoop, and a lot of the like urbanization of a lot of Native folks, or Native folks kind of moving to urban areas. But it seems like, just loosely in my non-historical imagination, that code talkers and their role in World War II seems like it's somehow important in this like changing of the general perception of like Native people as simultaneously not existing anymore and being like not American at all, to like somehow the American cowboy mythology starting to like fold the Native folks in this, like it was the Native people who gave the pilgrims the secrets to agriculture and surviving here that made it so we could be, whereas it seems like prior, all the spaghetti westerns and stuff, it seems like it's pretty much like the Native people were those violent savages who tried to stop our ancestors from making it west, if that makes sense.
Totally, yeah. I think in terms of what we were talking about, just like Mars and Gemini, like words as weapons, like the code talkers are totally part of that, right? Like it's, I mean, for ostensibly a positive reason, but like Native languages created a code that no one could break because no one could figure it out, right? And so, and it was Dene, but there were also Choctaw code talkers as well. And it's interesting because this is like the last, as you're saying, this is like the last generation of young men who are 18, 19, 20 years old who grew up speaking their language, right? After this point we start to see I mean, we see boarding schools before that as well, but in the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s was like the day school program started to get big as well, like opening day schools on reservations and more kids going to school. This is when compulsory education starts to really take hold in Native communities. In the earlier like boarding school era, and this is still the boarding school era in the mid 20th century, but not everyone went to boarding school. It was only like 30, like a third of the kids went to, which is a lot. It's a lot of kids to lose from the community, but it was 30% or so of the kids in any given community, more in some, less in others. Some had access to day schools, but in the mid 20th century we have the massive expansion of education, like Western style education that privileges English, that says being Native is wrong, you should assimilate, right? The 50s, the post-war period in the US was very much like assimilate to the like broader American middle class dream, like everyone making money, or just like move to the city, go make money, right? So from that point on, fewer families started to raise their children in Indigenous languages, to the point today where most Indigenous languages are massively endangered, if not totally asleep on this earthly plane. Some are fairly strong, like Dene is still fairly strong, but it is losing speakers. Most Indigenous languages are, but this World War II period is the kind of last period where people who grew up speaking their language are kind of asked to use it. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot more that could be said about that. It's not like totally relevant here, but like in World War II, the Germans were like super obsessed with Native Americans for like some reason.
Interesting.
And like sometimes there are like some stories that like the Americans would put Native people in a more visible role because the Germans were scared of like their fierce fighting power or something. Like silly, like ridiculous, but like in the German imagination, the like Native American, like American Indian just like held such like a power that there was like a psychological thing going on.
Interesting. Well, I'm generally okay with people believing that we're like extra magical and stuff.
Kill you by looking at you.
Yes, with our powers.
Yeah,
okay.
just gotta throw some blue steel and just there you go.
Are we gonna
So
try to
in
do the
terms of
quad wheel?
this, are there any other charts that we want to bring up like with these issues? I feel like we've done a fairly good survey of the
Yeah, I feel like we
charts at
have
play
the only
here, the
ones.
topics.
Yeah, the only other ones we haven't looked at would be like the Virgo full moon from this week with the news story, or any of the
Yeah, let's do that.
eclipses.
Let's go ahead and do that to wrap up.
Okay.
Because this news story came out on Monday. We're recording this on Thursday, March 9th,
Are we gonna
2023.
do
And
Virgo new moon to NAGPRA, Virgo new moon to US chart, or do you want me to pull up a tri-wheel?
let's do Virgo new moon to Tim Wise.
To Tim White's
Or
chart.
to Tim White, sorry, to the professor.
Yes.
I'm curious how it hits the professor and how it hits the university. So on Monday with the Virgo new moon or full moon, was when this news article came out that we're referencing, this article from ProPublica. So 16-degree Virgo, full moon.
Sorry, Mercury year, technical shenanigans.
All right.
Let's try this one more time, see if it works. Please.
There we go. Beautiful.
Yay.
Yeah, with that Mars squaring the full moon.
Mm-hmm.
The full moon's on Tim Wise's Saturn, which is on the US, Neptune.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of wide by degrees, but I think we've shown this like all the charts that we've looked at have had this mutable emphasis that they respond to.
Mm-hmm.
So when a trigger comes up like this, that especially including that Mars, it's like this story gets triggered.
Yeah, and we can see that in different ways too, right? It's like we can't necessarily take for Tim White, we just have the noonday chart. So we can't take this ascendant in Scorpio, but we can say, oh, look, the nodes are transiting his Mars. And we know that there is something about Mars that's related to this whole story, whether we're talking about the weaponization of language or we're talking about the fact that it's just like military conquests. And there's a lot of, even if we get more abstract and we look at the fight through doctrine, the fight related to language and theory itself even, we know that the Jupiter for NAGPRA is somewhere between Tim White's
I think it's 15.
Yeah, it's like 13 degrees Jupiter for NAGPRA, 13 degrees Jupiter in Leo. And so it's like that Jupiter position is near this midpoint for Tim White's Venus Pluto. And it's like, oh, there's the Venus Pluto that shows up in the Cal chart. There's the Venus Jupiter that shows up in the NAGPRA chart, even though it's a little bit wider. And so it's like, oh, if we have this combination of Venus and Jupiter together in some way, and we've got this combination of Mars and Uranus in a tight aspect in some way, then like those two together bring this like technology, language. Maybe there is something in the like Richard Tarnas's take on Uranus as Prometheus about like unleashing fire or a fuck you to the gods or to the established order that comes through this like handing over of some primal, I hate that word, but primal power. Here it's like something about, yeah, especially if this Uranus is like getting into the core egoic identity of the US, then it's like, well, the US has this myth that there was like this empty expanse and then we just manifested our destiny by moving westward. And it's like, actually, like the entire country's built on fucking burial grounds. Like it's, yeah, we could go into some other stuff there, but I think we see plenty of different things there. Even this like wide, we don't know his exact moon position, but this like his moon, like his moon is very tied up into that just like core Pluto story. And we see these like various echoes. And so thinking about like for anybody who's watching this and thinking about it, do you have some combination of Mars and Uranus or Pluto and Venus that activate or touch the US chart, touch NAGPRA's chart, whether or not you're an Indigenous person or know about your own, interrupted or not in terms of your legacy, disconnected or otherwise? Are you doing any work, or is this part of your own significant story? Like, I think there's some interesting things to look at there, or maybe it's some other story, and then like take a look at the national charts or local charts for the places that matter to you and the stories that are really impacting you, and see if there is some synastry between your natal chart and the charts of those like events or places.
And even organizations, like the organizations you work for, if you can find an opening date. I'm a teacher, and I have like the opening date of my school, which is like such a gift. It's a Mercury Pluto conjunction. Gotta love it.
Oh yeah.
Which I also, so like my school has a Mercury Pluto conjunction, and I do too.
Which makes sense as a historian,
right? Because what? Well, and the school is a Mercury Pluto and Libra. I'm a Mercury Pluto and Scorpio, but there's something about like, if the organization, whether that's a nation, whether that's a state, a city, an organization you're working for, if that has a signature and you have a signature that matches that energy, like you're supported there, right? Like your ability, like my ability to do my Mercury Pluto thing is supported at my school. It's not super comfortable, but it is what it is. So your synastry between yourself and your, as you're saying, all those different charts, but including the organizations you work for, the organizations you work with, all of that, and that can help explain why certain organizations have a certain feel, and why you might feel more comfortable or work better in one organization or another, or in one country or another, or in one city versus another.
Absolutely. Yeah.
On top of locational astrology, which is totally separate.
Oh yeah. I mean, we can look at that, and then if I can get this to bring us back to, we'll pull up the Sibley, since that's what most people know, even just thinking about like the US chart, if you happen to be based in the US, or most people in the world are impacted by US politics, whether they want to be or not. You can take a look at the US chart and see like, how does your natal chart interact with this chart? I look at this and I'm like, oh yes, okay, so my Aquarius moon, like I am deeply impacted by what's going on here, even though I don't tend to personally agree with it. Anybody with a Cancer rising, it's like, what's happening to you? What kind of things are you thinking about, around the 4th of July, whether you're like so about the fireworks or not, whether it's sentimental or otherwise. A lot of the folks who were born in the mid 80s are going to have their Saturn near the US ascendant. So there's something there about maybe an interest in US history, and talking a lot about how that US history impacts things. My Saturn is really close to this ascendant, which is also the moon for Columbus setting out and embarking. And lo and behold, I have a lot of Saturnian responses to Columbus and 1492 and colonization. And it's like deeply foundational to many of the things that I've done throughout my life. So yeah, I feel like we covered it. We got all of the historical events. I think we can maybe.
Yeah, and there's always more to say. We had like a whole little section that we wanted to talk about the Smithsonian, and it's like returning some remains to, not, and it wasn't even under NAGPRA, but returning artifacts to Nigeria, wrapped up with the recent eclipses in Scorpio and Taurus. I don't think we have time to go into that, but
No.
it's like there's always so much more to talk about with these kinds of charts. But I hope that we've kind of demonstrated some ways that you can layer charts, and yeah, especially like intermixing these like charts of nations, charts of organizations with our chart of Berkeley, and then nativities and mundane events, including eclipses and synodic cycles and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, particularly when there aren't timed charts,
Right.
if there's one timed chart, then you can at least get some house topics. Like we use the Sibley chart. We could do the same thing with the Howland chart or whatever other chart you like for the US, or your location or organization. But just going through and looking especially at that combination of energies or configurations, right? Where we weren't necessarily looking at Venus returning and Pluto returning, but seeing this repeated theme of the combination of Venus and Pluto, particularly conjunct, but
Yeah,
irrespective
particularly
of the
in fixed
signs that they were
signs.
in. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
particularly in
and
fixed
particularly
signs.
in this story, it's fixed signs.
Yeah. And so looking at those types of patterns, can lead you into some bigger conversations, like thinking about holographic transits and things like that in the tradition of Blatchkey. So there's so many different things we could look at. I think there is an interesting thread if folks want to follow up on that conversation, or maybe encourage us into conversation part 2 around the Smithsonian, particularly given its relationship with NAGPRA, and we talked about the Smithsonian's issue on their release of their policies related to the ethics of returning items. And then, as you mentioned, the Benin bronzes that were returned to Nigeria with the last set of eclipses. And if you're just thinking about where those degrees were, November 8th was a lunar eclipse that was smack dab in the middle of Scorpio and Taurus. And so that was like right on top of NAGPRA's Moon Pluto conjunction.
Yep. So the fundamental idea of the Moon Pluto conjunction in Scorpio and the need to transform and regenerate these 12th house topics in the Sibley chart of the things we want to keep hidden, the things that we want to put under the rug, the things that are more difficult to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the way that any institutions are impacting the distribution of power and privilege or oppression, marginalization. You see so many of those different components there. But hopefully subsumption is more clear to folks, and the both importance and just the really exciting and interesting things that are revealed by just finding those root charts. I would be especially curious to hear about anybody's work in finding a root chart for your own current work, whether that's activist or otherwise. So you have like a chart for your organization, a chart for your city. Are you using a chart for a concept, an idea, a historical work? If you're doing some sort of anti-capitalist stuff and you can't find a specific org, maybe you can use use Marx and use capital as a root chart for labor organizing and things like that. So if you have thoughts like that, I would love for you to drop those in the comments down below. I'll put some links for Alex's work, site, socials, etc. in the description box. You'll see this on my Patreon, my website, my YouTube, and we'll plug it around in other spaces. If you would like to see more of these types of conversations, then let us know. Do you have any wrap-up thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, no, you did that perfectly. If people like this, please let us know. We're always having these conversations behind the scenes, and we're happy to polish them up a little bit and present them to you all.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for reaching out and suggesting that we do this today, Alex. It's been an absolute pleasure, and yeah, I'm excited to have and share more conversations about this work in the future.
Me too. Yeah. Thanks so much for talking.
Thanks. Bye.